Well, let's turn that down a little bit. There we go. I'm certainly glad that you're here tonight. Let me take this. All right. Well, is that picking up? Let's see. All right, is that picking up okay? All right, well, we want to welcome you here tonight. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, and want to thank you for coming. And I know that some of you are watching on Facebook, or no, YouTube, I guess, here at Moraine Valley Church. I want to thank you for viewing in tonight. We're going to be in session 3, and you should have, if you're on our email list, received the notes already in the email that I sent out today. If you don't have them, then you can simply email me, ron@empowerministry.org. That's ron@empowerministry.org, and I'll be happy to send them to you. And I could also put you on our email list, so then you'll be getting the notes as well. Really excited that you're here tonight. We're going to be talking about the brain. We're going to be starting on the session 3. We're going to do a series, probably about 8 weeks, I guess, covering the brain. And I'm really excited about bringing that to us and teaching it. I've been teaching for a long time and on emotional issues as well. For the last 15 years, we've been doing this program. And what really made this different than what we've done in the past has been the emphasis on the neuroscience. Not that it's all about the neuroscience, but the fact that the neuroscience has made such a difference. It's made such a difference in how we understand why we behave and why we do the things. So we're going to be talking about that tonight. Why don't we, though, just go ahead and open in prayer, ask God to, this is a special night here in this country, of course, with the election. So let's just give all that over to God. And Father, I thank you, Lord, for this day. Father, the election in our country, and we thank you, Lord, that people have the freedom here to exercise their right to vote. And Father, we thank you for what you're going to do. We pray for this nation, Lord, that there'd be unity, that, Lord, there'd be healing where there's anger and hurt. And, Father, that we would be one nation and that many people would see that we'd be one nation under you. And so, Father, just help us as a church and as people of God to be those kind of representatives of your kingdom here on earth. And so, Father, thank you, Lord, for this special day. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's go ahead and start then with the brain part 1. One of the most exciting elements, I think, of our emotional resilience class is the foundations in today's neuroscience. When I first studied counseling, it was back in the 70s, 1970s, not the 1870s, but the 1970s, and I was studying pastoral counseling. I was in the ministry, and I wanted to study, well, how do we do that? So I took what was called nouthetic counseling and some others. And one of the reasons I did that is because I had issues of my own. It came out in marriage there early on, and that, man, I had a lot of anxiety, and I needed answers. I was busy in the ministry, but at night when things shut down, I was just all full of anxiety, and then it turned into depression, and I had a lot of things I was worried about. And so I was really doing it for me, although I seemed to attract a lot of people in ministry that had needs as well, and I wanted to be able to minister to them. Back then, a lot of the biblical counseling, and that and still is to some degree, was directive, what we call directive counseling, where, hey, you got a problem, I'll tell you how to solve it. I'm pretty direct in telling you what you need to do. And I understand that. I mean, we would sit there and have the Bible open and tell them scriptures where they could, try to obey what the Bible's saying. And I understand a directive approach, and that's what early on we studied. When I went to undergraduate school, I wanted to continue and study psychology. There we came up with, there was a new, what they called the third wave, and it was this phenomenological existential psychology, which really put an emphasis on the person, try to understand a person, enter their world, be client-centered was the big term. And it had a lot to do with emotions, which was so counter to some degree of the experimental psychology that was going on and the cognitive psychologies. But then when I went into master's studies in graduate school, there was cognitive behavior was the big gun, and it still is. It's still a big influence in psychology. But what happened, and why I say that, is because we're talking about emotional resilience. What happened in the 1990s was what President Bush called at that time the decade of the brain. With all the new imaging equipment and the computer power. Many of you remember starting off with those first personal computers. They had the Osborne and the Commodore 64, and then IBM came out with theirs. Well, what happened, exponentially, they started gaining more and more processing power. And as that processing power became more portable and more fast, of course, they were able to start doing some real science with imaging equipment. And so they were able to scan the brain, and they were able to work with animals and humans as well, and start finding out what's going on in the brain when we do certain things. And they were able to make correlations and things, and so all kinds of things have come out about how the brain works and how it affects the way that we behave. The thing that we want to emphasize in here, and we will next week as well, is that basically the brain is a learning machine, and it learns things, and a lot of times we learn the wrong thing, and so how do we relearn something else? And that's really what we're going to be looking at. The brain's a predicting machine based on assumptions, and a lot of times it drives us emotionally, and so we're going to study how does that whole nervous system work, and we're going to have just I think a good time. Dr. Alan Shore and Dan Siegel were two of the primary guys that started this whole new wave, which later was called affective psychology, which means emotional, psychology. And a lot of what we're teaching in here comes out of this whole new realm of study that's been just phenomenal, and it's around the world now. And so I'm so excited to be able to bring it with a Christian perspective. Because I think it points to the beauty and the creative force that God put in us. This brain is so incredible. The way he's made us is just phenomenal, and I think it points to God. And so I'm real excited about helping us learn this and having it affect our behavior and our outcome and what we're doing. So on page 2, we look at the incredible brain here. And to understand emotional resilience, and that means to bounce back, right, from emotional difficulties, we need to understand the brain for, I think, at least 2 reasons. First, we'll start understanding that there's real reasons behind some of what we're doing, that why we behave and feel the way we are. And you'll find it freeing and full of hope. You see, when I had a lot of my problems, and I was all anxious, and I was looking for answers. Well, there was 2 answers back then in the Christian realm anyways. One, it's your subconscious mind. And that term is popular, came out of Freudian psychology. And the fact is, well, what do you do with a subconscious mind? I mean, it's unconscious. And I remember praying and saying, Lord, help me. Lord, please take my subconscious mind, do something in there, because I felt helpless. I didn't know what I could do about that. There was some driving force. Well, and of course, the other realm in the Christian circles, of course, was the demonic, right? And I understand that. And as a Christian pastor in that, I've studied that. And Neil Anderson came out with some great materials. And so I could do things in that realm, but I didn't know exactly what to do with this subconscious. And then, the cognitive psychology started coming out, and we started seeing what we can deal with behavior, and that helped. But today, now knowing about the brain, what's so exciting, not only do we know how we learn and how we can relearn, the fact is, too, we can become a participant. We can become a participant in our own change, and that's exciting. We don't have to wait for others. We can take some of these things that we learn here and start applying them, start using them because they work, and that's exciting. So we're going to talk about a lot of powerful ways to use the brain in healing our emotions. And the goal, though, and you can relax, is not to make you a neuroscientist. There's a lot of parts of the brain. We're not going to learn every one of them. We're going to learn a few. And we'll only, even after that, pare it down just to maybe 3 or 4 parts. And you'll get to know them because we'll repeat them over and over. And it'll make a lot of sense to you as we go. In fact, some of you have taken this last year. You probably already know the parts, and this is just going to be a repeat for you, and it hopefully will make even more sense now that you're here again. Well, this 3 pounds, it's about 3 pounds mass of, gray matter, kind of like a cauliflower, right, that sits in the skull here. It's the center of all our activity. It has, over 86, we're on page 2, over 86 billion neurons, that's nerve endings, right, that extend to every organ and every part of the body via the spinal cord and the autonomic nervous system. This body is well wired. It travels at like 285 miles an hour. I mean, you know how fast that is? I mean, if a car was going by almost at 300 miles an hour, it wouldn't take long to go 6 feet, would it? And that's how fast, and it communicates back and forth, and it's just an amazing thing. Out of that, then, each one of those neurons have like 10,000. Now, some people say 20,000, whatever. Let's say 10. That means hundreds of trillions of connections are made. And so, it's amazing. Now, we'll talk about different parts of the brain, and a lot of times what's taught is that this part does this part does that, this part. But what we're finding out now, and the reason we say that is because it lights up, right? When we do different kinds of reviews of it, we can see where this area lights up when this happens, this area. And so the assumption is, well, that must be working. But what we know now is that really it's more integral than that. And that there's a lot of different parts of the brain working at once. And when you have this kind of neuronal network, it's not just chemicals going across the synapses. There's multiple ones, and each one has different ways to attract different ones. So things move in like waves. I mean, it's just amazing. All of a sudden, something's happening. You'll see things will go this way. Then things are going this way, and they'll line up. It's just amazing how it works. It's the most complex thing in the universe. It's just amazing. And in fact, I've been studying a lot about neuropeptides and things that go on in the body, and the whole body reacts. I mean, take when you feel a sense of shame. You'll be walking, right, and all of a sudden you think of something, or maybe there's someone that's mad at you, or you did something against them a long time ago. It's over, but you see them, and as soon as you do, you feel this sense of shame. What do? Do you just walk, or do you kind of look down and maybe tilt your head a little bit and your shoulders kind of something? The whole body reacts. And I really believe that this is part of the key of what we're going to find out later in emotional relearning, is that I think there's might almost say there's like signatures. That when we have these different kinds of primary emotions that deal because of certain behaviors, certain attitudes, if I feel that, I've been a people pleaser, okay, which was part of my issue, and I was shame-based. And so in people pleasing, what you find a lot of times is that you're worried about what other people are going to think. You're trying to do it, and if they're mad at you, you get all upset Because if they're mad at me, and I don't do what they're doing, they're going to abandon me. And if I abandon me, and it's this childlike thinking that's come from a long time ago that doesn't make any sense, but I don't have time to argue with it. Because, see, these beliefs are embodied. They're felt beliefs. And emotions are sensations that get us to move. And so we don't often have time to argue. We don't argue against it. We're just reacting. And if we could have a video camera to watch, we react sometimes like a child, because it's really those childish things that are still alive in us. And part of what we're going to try to do is go back and figure out that and overcome it. And the way we do that, and I'm getting way ahead of the game, the way we do that is I take an instance where I'm feeling something. Let's say that I just saw that person where I felt shame. And now I'm thinking about it later. And so now I become my own observer, and I say, okay, let's go back to that. What did I feel like? Where was that? Where was it in the body? What did I feel like? What was I believing? Well, I was believing that, they don't like me. I'm going to, and I was all anxious. And then I can just hang on to that. And if I allow myself thinking that, it can take me to a memory where I felt that way before. Because here again, that's that signature kind of theory. That my body knows that these certain beliefs have caused this certain reaction, and it's pretty consistent. Until I change the beliefs, I'm going to react that way many, many times. And so what we do then is that we start to get in touch then with what we're believing, and then we can change it. We can emotionally change what we believe, and we'll talk about that some more when we get down there. But anyways, the neurons and the synapses allow for an infinite number of patterns, and it's just tremendously complex and beautiful. The brain regulates our body functions, our thinking, our emotions, and behavior. The brain is that command center, right, of our human nervous system, and it regulates our body functions, our thinking, our emotions, our behavior. And there are many different parts of the brain that work together. It controls our body temperature, right? Our blood pressure, our heart rate, our breathing. It receives a flood of sensory information about the world around you from various senses. It handles your physical movement when walking, talking. I mean, we're so complex. We take for granted when we watch kids play basketball, or if you've played basketball or baseball, when you throw something, if you go to throw a ball into a hoop, that is a complex behavior. I mean, that is super complex. The formulas that need to go, what the brain has to do to predict how soft or how hard to throw it in that direction, to learn that kind of behavior is tremendously complex. And the movement, just to walk right and do things. If you don't believe me, try playing golf sometime. I was a baseball player and hockey player, right? And then I tried to learn to play golf. Well, golf is a whole different swing, and don't watch me, because I don't know how. I gave up. I wanted to slap it like a hockey stick, right? Or like a low ball coming in, and hit it out of the park. Well, that's not a golf swing. And for me to try to retrain myself, it was very, very complex. And so it's amazing how many things we take for granted that we're able to do because of the brain. And you've seen people that have strokes, or have some kind of brain disability, and sometimes they have to learn to do all these motions over. I had to teach some children how to eat, and had to teach them the motion of how to eat when I was doing an internship. And I had to do it over and over and over to train them how to just move a fork and put it into their mouth. So because they didn't have the brain functioning in the way that we do. So it's a complex, beautiful thing that God has given us. And there's this integration between the emotions and the brain. A lot of times the emotions can affect what's happening. And we'll be talking about that in future times as we go along. So it's exciting to know that we have this, brain, the spinal cord, all the peripheral nerves in our body, and they make up this complex, integrated information processing and control system known as the central nervous system. And it's just, it works the conscious and unconscious parts of our being. So it's really, really exciting. Well, let's turn to the next page here, and you'll see that there's two hemispheres of the brain. Now, we don't usually think of that way, and frankly, for some of us, that may be the first time we've heard this. We've heard maybe of right brain, left brain, because The Artist's Way was a book that came out many years ago, and it really started talking about right brain and how the right brain is more creative in that. But that's about as far as a lot of people know. Rather, what happens is we know more about the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, they should be working together. But it's interesting as we've mapped things in the brain that we know that, look at the list here, the left brain. Doesn't it sound a lot like school? Doesn't it sound a lot what we've put value on in this country? In fact, if I was going to have a quiz and say, what does the brain do? We would probably put a lot of these things, especially if they have children, because what do the report cards grade, right? The analytical thought, logical and intellectual, language, reading, writing, scientific skills, mathematics, logic, lists, speech, time, sequence. It recognizes words, recognizes letters and numbers. And so we watch children be able to do this, right? And of course, they learn more progressively as they go through the years in school. And so that's a lot of times what we attach that the brain does. But look at the other side, because there's other things that we know that happen, but we may never have thought that, this is a right brain. This is more holistic thinking. When we're being intuitive, when we're going, well, I got a hunch, my gut's telling me, that's coming from the right brain into the gut, right? Music, those of us that love music, do music, that's a right brain phenomena. Creativity, and there's all kinds of ways to be creative, right? Emotional expression, imagination is a right brain phenomena. And sensory impressions, patterns, spatial relationships, proximity, right? I mean, when a person gets too close to you, invading your space, aren't you aware of that? That's a right brain phenomena. And context, and it recognizes faces, places, objects. It recognizes sounds and sensory feedback, and it's emotional. Now you say, Ron, why are we learning this? Because a lot of our behavior, and I want you to notice this. Let's look at that right side again, the right brain. Before we would talk about our behavior being on the left side, well, are you being logical? Are you being intellectual? Does this make sense? What's wrong with you? Aren't you thinking clearly? And we're always wanting to put it in this left brain thing. This makes sense. But when we think of behavior, a lot of it comes out of being intuitive. Well, why'd you do that? Well, I felt, right? It is certainly, they were all emotional. I get upset. Do I get upset when someone gets mad at me? Of course. They're expressing their emotions. I express my emotions. That's a right brain talking to a right brain, right? Imagination. Well, that doesn't affect anything. Sure it does. When you have a fear, there's two kinds of fears. One is there's a guy right in front of you right now that's coming at you, and he's got a knife in his hand. That's a factual thing. That's fearful, right? But we don't usually have those we anticipate someone might come to us, or we anticipate something. And so that's using our imagination. And we imagine these things, even though it might be based on some credibility, but still we fear and we imagine it, and our imagination has a lot to do with depression, with fear, and we can use that same imagination to really help us realize other things. When we think of God, right, we're thinking not just intellectual, we're using that kind of imaginative part of our body, right, a brain where we sit there and we were in His presence. Lord, we have our eyes closed, we're imagining, but yet it's a reality. Just because we imagine something, it's a spiritual discipline there, using that part of the brain. And then look at the recognizes faces. That's huge. Places and objects. A lot of what happens, a lot of things that trigger us come out of what we see and smell and hear. So if you were raised, and this program came out of addictions years ago, and so I would work with a lot of people that had addictions, and a lot of them, sometimes it's second generation, right? And so we would talk about when Dad would come home, you know, and so, you know, he'd have that look on his face. You could tell when he pulled up in the driveway, the gravel driveway, the way the brakes hit. You could tell whether, oh boy, is he upset or not. The way the door closed, you know, the way he walked into the back porch, you know. And so, you know, if the father was abusive, an alcoholic, let's say, you could remember the smell of the breath, the tone of the voice, right? The hand gestures. And so then years later, we're cued to see some of those things. I had this people-pleasing thing. If you wanted to get to me, all you had to do is kind of put your glasses down a little bit and get a clipboard and go something like this, you know, and go, Ron, I want to talk to you. Can I see you? And oh my gosh. Because a person in authority that has that kind of condescending look or that kind of tone of voice that says, I'm in trouble, pew, off I went, right? And I learned over a while to regulate that and go in there and see, but my eyes are like this, you know. and so this right kind of brain hemisphere things really can trigger us. And a lot of times we're unaware why. We don't know why. And yet if we could stop and analyze it, we could see that this certain look reminded us of something else and on and on. And we'll get into that kind of stuff. But that's why this is so important. And smells, sounds, all those things can be triggers. You know, we talk about triggers a lot. I have a new book called out the Habit Challenge over there, and in there I just finished videoing a whole class that we're doing on it, and we spent a whole lesson on triggers because these things trip us up. And so you can be driving and then you go past the favorite bar you used to go to. Ooh, next thing you know, you're in there, right? It was a trigger. And so the brain picks up a lot of these kinds of triggers. Well, let's take a minute here, and you know, you got people at your table maybe, and which hemisphere are you more dominant in? When you look at the list, where are you more dominant? Doesn't mean that you don't have the others, but are you more dominant one side to the other? Are you about the same? Why don't you take a minute and talk about that? Those of you that are watching at home, if you have someone with you, why don't you do it together? If you're by yourself, and that's okay, then why don't you journal? You know, get a piece of paper or write on the back or whatever and ask yourself, you know, which one am I more dominant? So let's take a few minutes and do that, okay? All right, take about one more minute. Now, what we want to do is kind of be responsible to use the whole brain, right? I mean, a lot of times a person's real logical and they're not very emotional, and that can be an issue in relationships. Sometimes a person is real emotional, but they're not being more analytical, and that can cause problems. A lot of times in marriage, opposites attract, right? And so it's nice if we can learn to open up both sides of our brain and try to, improve in both areas. And we'll be doing that as we go along. We'll be working on, we're going to predominantly be working in the right hemisphere, though, because I find that's really where a lot of people are more lacking. If they're already emotional, a lot of times it's overuse, so we want to tame it a little bit and bring it back. But most people are more afraid of their emotions, don't really know how to deal with them, and yet they're working with them all the time. So I find that a lot of people learn a lot about that part of their brain. Actually, we'll be using both. Let's look at page 4 here, the one brain in 3 parts. Although these areas, let's call them areas maybe instead of parts, but there's like 3 areas. And when you're describing things, to a novice, if someone wasn't from the United States and they asked you where you lived, you could tell them, well, I live in the United States. And that might be enough. They'll go, oh, okay, you're from the United States. And you would be right. But if they knew a little bit about the United States, they might say, well, where? And you could say, well, I live in the Midwest. And so they could say, okay, that's kind of in the center, right, the Midwest. But if they knew a little bit more and they want to know, okay, well, where in the Midwest? You could say, well, I live in Illinois. And if they knew about the states, you could say, well, I live in Illinois. Now, all 3 are right? You live in the United States, you live in the Midwest, you live in Illinois. But this person knows a little bit about it. They want to know more. Well, where at? Well, I live in the Chicago area. Oh, I've heard of Chicago, deep dish pizza, right? And so they know about Chicago, and so they're curious, well, whereabouts in Chicago? And you could say, well, I'm on the southwest side of Chicago, and you'd be right. And they go, oh, the south, I have someone there. What town do you live in? And, of course, you could say, Palos Heights, Tinley, Orland Park, whatever, Elsip, wherever it is that you might live. Every one of those are right. But you get a little more specific. And the reason I bring that up is that if you're going to study this, which is cool, I hope this builds some curiosity. It's coming like a freight train. More and more people are talking about the brain all the time. You see it on TV more and more. They'll use different names. We're talking about similar things. One of the most common ones is the limbic system. You can see it right in the middle. And you'll hear that. That's the emotional area of the brain. So a lot of people refer to that. Now, some will break it down into parts, which we'll do in a few minutes, and that's okay too. Some of them will combine the parts and they'll make it an axis, where they're working together. So you're going to hear a lot of different terminology. For the sake of what we're doing, we're looking at 3 areas here. We're looking at first the front, this whole thing that covers the outside of the brain. There's the cortex. And the front that does a lot of the executive center of the brain, where a lot of the thinking comes from, is this prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. And so it's right here kind of behind your eyes. And so I want to call that the thinking brain. That's the thinking brain. It processes rational data, shares its deductions with the other 2 parts of the brain. It's where assumptions are made, predictions, right? Then you have this limbic area, which is the emotional center of the brain. And the limbic brain feels, it processes emotions and gut feelings and shares its finding with the other 2 parts, unless it assumes it's dangerous. When it assumes it's dangerous, then it kidnaps the brain and puts us in a fight, flight, or freeze. We go into immediate action. That's what it's there for. It's part of our survival. And it works with the other part, that brain stem, which is that instinctive brain. We have the thinking brain, the emotional brain. Now, one way to look at the thinking brain is the reflective. We want to reflect. And a lot of times what we're going to try to learn in here, we have emotional relearning and emotional regulation and emotional recognition. We start with emotional recognition, right? And so emotional recognition is where we go ahead and we recognize when we're starting to get emotional. And that's why we're going to, we're talking about the brain, but we want to understand when are we starting to get, and emotions start in the body. What we're going to become hopefully experts in is sensing what's going on before we have an outburst or before we get all sad. Before we can sense it in our body, because the root word of emotion means to move. It gets us to move. And it comes out of this, not the reflective, it comes out of the reactive. It's part of the reactive brain, right? And so a lot of times what we want to do is slow it down. We start to sense something's getting ready to react. We slow it down and we reflect. It's called pause and plan. Or it could be pause and, think and then do, right? And so we want to start training ourselves, to go ahead and recognize. And then we want to regulate. We want to be able to regulate our emotions. And so when we can start to regulate them, what it does, it allows then that prefrontal cortex to come online. I've used this illustration before, but one of the, I had a lot of fears and phobias. Ones that, was pretty common with kids, but certainly was with me, was that fear of going in the basement. It was dark. I didn't like the dark. I was afraid there was a monster down there. I was sure of it, although I never seen it, never felt it, but hey, it was there. And I remember my dad tried to show me there was no monster there. I remember he took me by the hand, come on, son, we'll go down there. We went down there. And I remember as we were exiting the basement, he was saying, well, see, there's no monster. And I remember thinking to myself, sure, when you're here, what monster's going to be there when my dad is, duh, he only comes when I'm there because I'm, vulnerable. And you're going to find out that this vulnerableness is huge. Okay, because as children, we are. And so later, when I was a little older, maybe, I can't remember, 6th grade, I can't remember, I was a little older, old enough to know that this is kind of getting silly, and yet fearful enough to know that this still scares me. I remember coming in the basement, because we'd have to go with my mom. Why in the world she couldn't keep canned goods upstairs is beyond me, but she kept them in the basement. But not just the basement, the farthest part of the basement, down by the furnace. You had to walk through a door, throw a curtain back, go down there by the furnace, On the bottom shelf was all the canned goods, the corn and the beans and all this stuff. So you had to walk this whole basement to get there and then run all the way back out. Well, I remember going through the first door, and I came into the basement, and all of a sudden, there it was, finally. Sasquatch, there it was. It was about 7 foot tall, and it was kind of wide. And I remember thinking, looking, and I'm ready to run. But I'm a little older now, right? I think I was 33. No, I was I wasn't that old. But anyways, I was a little older now, and I'm thinking, okay, I better not. And so part of me is there, yes, no, yes. And the good news is I waited long enough and looked long enough. All of a sudden, I realized it was my mom's dress that she hung up off the conduit up there, so it was off the floor way high, and it was a big dress, and it was draped down. She was letting it dry, right? Well, had I just reacted, right, I saw something, it was a shadow, whatever, out I go, but I didn't go, and so it was long enough to what? Bring the prefrontal cortex online. And it was able to analyze. And see, that's that's a simplistic view of what we're going to learn to do in here, is to be able to work with the whole brain and be able to recognize when we're starting to be emotion, bounce back, regulate it, and while we're regulating it, hopefully we'll be able to make some good decisions. If not, we'll then be moving into the emotional relearning where, okay, what's triggering us in the first place? See, we could be coping for the rest of our life. I mean, when I had people in class, and they've been coping for 10 years, and if we're not careful, we'll be coping 10 years from now. And that's okay, but it's better to find out in the first place what's bothering you. And you say, well, what do you mean emotional relearning? The trouble is, all of this stuff isn't just intellectual learning. And I always use this example, but I think it's a powerful one and it makes sense. We've all met someone who's either handsome or beautiful, at least good enough, right? And they feel they're ugly. And you try to tell them, hey, you're not ugly. And you could get them to repeat it 50 times. You could have them write it on the chalkboard, right, or the whiteboard. I'm beautiful, I'm beautiful. It isn't going to. Why? Because emotionally, somewhere, they believe that. Their body image is such that they're just full of shame and feel they're ugly. It could have been from body shaming or whatever. It isn't until they emotionally relearn, and it's a hard one to relearn, but it can be done, that they can emotionally find out that they're good enough. It's not going to come intellectually. It's going to be when we go back to one of those memories, go back to something that where it's triggered, and find out what was said, what was done, what caused this shame, and then find out what the truth is. And when you can find out from another source, be it God, who's the final authority, be it a grandmother that you're imagining, what would she say, your own wiser self, something that makes sense comes into that memory and changes the meaning. That's emotional. When you feel, can you imagine if you felt ugly and then all of a sudden the right kind of source, something came in and all of a sudden convinced you that you're good enough, how good you'd feel? I mean, this weight would be lifted up. You've had things like that where you had the wrong assumption and you were all of a sudden either forgiven or it was changed or, things were different. It was like this weight was off. I remember that happened once. I was running late for this class and I just felt horrible. It was a big test, and I thought, oh, what am I doing? I'm going to flunk and all this stuff, and I get there, find out it's tomorrow. Weight was lifted off. I felt real relieved at that moment, right? And in a sense, that's what happened. See, something came. There was an authoritative piece of paper that said test is the next day, right? And that settled it. It was over. And that's what happens when we can emotionally relearn the truth. What it is we're relearning the truth, but it has an emotional impact. That's what it really means. Because, see, the lie that started it had an emotional impact. When that person that's handsome and good enough, beautiful, feels they're ugly, that's an emotional feeling. No one wants to feel that. And that was it's a belief that causes an emotional feeling, so it's an emotional belief. And what we're looking to do is find out what the truth is. And when the truth comes in, and we really see it, it's emotional, and it changes then. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that make some sense there? Okay? That's where we're heading. And that's why we'll use both these parts of the brain. We want to understand what's happening in the limbic system, what's causing this, and then we want to be able to use that prefrontal cortex and use them both together where we can find out what's triggering us and change it. Now, that brain stem is part of that reflective part of the brain as well, because what happens, it gets its orders from the emotional brain and it pumps it right through the body. It goes through that autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system, and we'll study that in a few weeks, is divided into two parts. It has the sympathetic nervous system that gets us moving, right? And then it has a parasympathetic, which slows us down or goes into a freeze, and we'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. And so it's exciting to know this, and let's look at each one of these then, okay? Number one is the brainstem. The brainstem's that life control center, okay? It's the part that monitors and controls our body's vital functions, such as heart rate, breathing, body temperature, and balance. It's focused on our survival. A lot of that, becoming aware of things comes through that back part of our brain. It's subconscious and instinctual, anger, fear, aggression, territory. Let's get going, okay? We've got to do it. And it gets us out there. And it works a lot with that limbic system. So when we take drugs, drink alcohol, are overwhelmed with fear, become angry, the prefrontal cortex, that thinking part of the brain, it's not online. That behavior is being controlled by that limbic and the brainstem area. And we're back in the back part of our brain. And so a lot of times, that's why in addictions, a lot of times you have post-acute withdrawal. It takes a while because we've been using that part of the brain so much. It takes a while to really get the signals going. You're kind of in not a fog, but it takes a while to really start feeling your own natural self. Plus, you've been pumping in all these chemicals that have overdone your neurotransmitters, and so you need to build all that up. But the main thing is that the brain stem there is what gets us going. One of the main areas we're going to look at is on page 5, and that's that limbic area, okay? And now we've got some parts here, and really the only 2 parts that you'll really hear a lot about in here is the amygdala and the hippocampus. But let me tell you about the other 2 anyways, but you don't have to really learn them so much. The thalamus is the sensory regulator. It continues scanning our environment, and it takes the sensory information and relays it to the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. What I usually say is when the amygdala senses something, it goes off, right? It goes into hype. And what that means is, okay, the thalamus sends information to it. You don't really need to memorize that. We're not going to use that part much, but it's good to know it. What happens is really it's what's called a reticular activating system, and it picks up things that are important. Now, what's interesting, a lot of this is cued to who you are. My wife and I had a dual alarm clock, and so I would set my alarm, and she would set hers, right? And she worked farther than I did. She had to get up a little earlier, and I'm a night owl, so I'll take any sleep I can get, in the morning. I'll stretch it out in the morning. So she'd get up, 45 minutes before me. Well, those 45 minutes are precious to me because I've stayed up longer than her, right? And so what was so ironic is that she'd be up when my alarm would go off. She'd be up, and I never heard her alarm. Now, sometimes, she never heard mine because she was gone. but the fact, but the point is, I never heard hers. Now, when we had children, right, when the first baby was born, I didn't take too much of the responsibility. I kind of did one of those, hey, honey, but I shouldn't have been that way. But, she had the milk, and so, I figured, what the heck, the baby wants food, right? And so, do you think I heard the baby when it cried? No, the chauvinist that I was, no, I didn't hear it. She heard it. I mean, that baby could just make a whimper, and boy, she was up. But if a branch off a tree hit the roof, or if something outside knocked the can over, do you think she heard it? No, I did. I was up. Isn't it interesting? See, I felt that protective part of the family. I felt like my role was, hey, danger's coming, I got to get up. She felt, hey, the baby's crying, I have the equipment, right? I may as well, Now, did I ever get up and carry the baby? Because our first one had colic. Yes, I did. I did my part. I had to walk. In fact, I was pretty darn good at soothing the baby down. And but you get what I'm saying, right? We're kind of tuned in sometimes to different things because if we understood everything that's going on, we couldn't handle it. There's so many things going on. Like right now, if you really stopped, you can hear the air, you can hear the hum that's in the air, right? But when you're not focusing on that, that's going on, you know it's there, but you're not paying attention to it. And it's the same thing. And so that part of our body is thalamus, and what happens, it knows what to look for. And so that look, if you knew that, a certain look meant that you were in trouble, it's going to cue you. The thalamus is going to see it, and it's going to tell that amygdala. Amygdala is going to say it's dangerous, and you're going to be all like this, and you may not even know why. And even if you did know why, you wouldn't care because you're reacting at that moment, okay? it will take time, and you'll be able to see, because what we're going to do is slow that down, and we're going to be able to say, oh, I know what happened. I saw that look. And I thought this was going to happen. You see, we'll get to it, but a lot of times we're already reacting without knowing why. And so, and the real why is, why did that look bother you in the first place? And that's where we'll really be investigating, because that's when we can change that. That's when behavior is really going to be changed. When we can get to a place where that person can look all the way they want like that, and it doesn't bother me anymore because I'm not worried about being annihilated. I'm not worried about, they're going to not like me. Now, does that mean I'm not going to be loving and kind? Of course, but I'm not going to panic. You see, because I've changed that belief about me. You see, does that make some sense there? That's where we're heading. And so that's the beauty. And so when we start to learn these things, we'll be able to get behind what's going on. Well, the amygdala, like I said, it's the one that takes that, particularly fear, and acts like a central alarm station. So when the amygdala perceives danger, it acts as a default system, a thinking bypass process, triggering automatic reactions, right? And so it gets going. Now, the hypothalamus, here again, and this is the only time we'll probably talk about it, but the reason I am is because of the HPA axis that you see in parentheses. It's becoming more and more popular, so I thought I might as well put it in there. And what it means is that what happens is that this behavior and expression of emotion, and it organizes actions, right, into that fight, flight, and freeze. And that fight, flight, and freeze is really controlled by